You can.
Ira, if you'd like to begin, please.
There we go. I'm off mute now. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ira Laudermilk, and I serve as the Deputy of Legislative Affairs for the Law Office of the Cook County Public Defender, where it is our mission to protect the fundamental rights, liberties, and dignity of each person whose case has been entrusted to us by providing the finest legal representation. And I'm also proud to say that I am a Civic Leadership Academy Class of 2020 alumni, a program that is based in the Harris School of Public Policy. Over the course of my career, I have served in numerous leadership roles in the criminal justice and juvenile justice systems at the state and local levels, implementing policies and practices that enhance positive outcomes for justice-involved people. That is challenging, but critically important work. And thankfully, every once in a while, my colleagues and I who have worked in this space for several years are able to celebrate when our collaborative efforts yield real reform, like the historical omnibus criminal justice and police accountability legislation that recently passed in the Illinois General Assembly. But there is still so much more work to be done. And that's why today's conversation is so important. We are all living in unprecedented times. We in Chicago and throughout the rest of the country are all grappling with an increase in violence, worsening social, racial, and income inequalities, and a host of other pressing policy changes exacerbated by the fact that we're doing all of this in the midst of a global pandemic. Our cities need the next generation of leaders who will have an impact in our institutions and also in our communities. These issues won't be resolved overnight, so we must make sure that we are all doing our part to effectuate reform, that we are also mentoring the next generation and others with an interest in doing this work to ensure that our efforts today will be carried forth tomorrow and beyond. And with that, I'd like to take a personal liberty and plug the mentoring program at the Harris School of Public Policy, which pairs students with mentors who serve in the public policy arena. I have participated in this program for the last 3 years and have found the experience to be mutually rewarding for the students, as well as for me as their mentor. And our relationships often last beyond the official program itself. And with that, I'd like to thank the Harris School and the Crime Lab and the Education Lab for hosting this timely conversation on policy innovation and impact in our communities. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Harris Senior Fellow, Michael A. Nutter, who served as the 98th Mayor of Philadelphia from 2008 to 2016. At his inaugural address, Mayor Nutter pledged to lower crime, improve educational attainment rates, make Philadelphia the greenest city in America, and attract new businesses and residents to the city. He also promised to lead an ethical and transparent government, focused on providing high quality, efficient, and effective customer service. During his time in office, Mayor Nutter made significant contributions in all of these areas, and notably doing so during an economic recession. Joining Mayor Nutter, we also welcome Rosanna Ander, founding executive director of the Crime Lab and Education Lab. Rosanna is an appointee to the International Association of Chiefs of Police Research Advisory Committee and formerly served on the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission and on the public safety transition teams for both Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner. And I thank you all for being here. And now I will turn it over to Mayor Nutter.
Era, thank you very, very much, and good evening, everyone. Certainly exciting to be with you. Normally, I would say it's really exciting to be here this evening, but you know, I'm in Philadelphia, and many of you, I'm sure, are in Chicago. But we're here nonetheless through the wonders of technology. First, I do want to thank Dean Baker and her entire team, great folks at Harris School of Public Policy. I get to work with the dean and her team, as well as I get to work with Rosanna Ander and the great folks over at Urban Lab. So, you know, Rosanna, I think we need to jump right in. We're going to talk about the labs, obviously, but you know, because we're a public policy school, you know, I always find it interesting for folks to have a little better understanding of how do any of us arrive at this work. They often meet us, you know, when we've become who we are, but might not know a great deal about the start. So to the extent you're comfortable, how did you come to be in this space, get in this work? What is it that drove you or led you or helped guide you to be involved in this work? You could have done anything, I'm sure.
Well, thank you for that. And it's really wonderful. Thanks, Era, for doing this. And again, thank you, Dean Baker, for the opportunity. And Mayor Nutter, you have just done so much for the city of Philadelphia and also for the city of Chicago. So I do want to thank you. You've been so engaged in so many ways here. And we just need as much talent as we can muster here. So yeah, brevity is not my strong suit, so I will try to be as brief as possible. So I actually grew up quite poor. Essentially, was raised by a single mom who was raising 4 kids, and we struggled in every imaginable way. And
where was this, Roseanne? Where?
We moved around a lot.
Okay.
I lived for a time on the edge of the Shenandoah River in a cabin with no running water. And my mom did as best she could, raising 4 kids. My father was sort of in and out of the picture, but largely by herself. And I think the thing that sort of really set me on the path, in addition to having a mom who, despite our economic circumstances, was very, very, I think, socially and politically aware, was one particular incident, which was when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I had double pneumonia and was quite sick. And because we couldn't afford to see a doctor unless it was a true emergency, it was a true emergency. And I remember the doctor just really berating my mother for being a terrible mom for not taking me in sooner. And I remember just thinking, I knew she was doing the best she could. And years later, after we sort of managed to, or I managed to graduate from high school, my uncle, I had been supporting myself for about the first year after I graduated. And I had an uncle call me and say, you know, if you want to go to college, I'd be happy to help. And so that gave me an opportunity to go to college. And what I decided to do, really hearkening back to that experience, was I thought I would go to medical school. But I realized that practicing medicine in this country would be enormously frustrating, partly because you have to serve one person at a time. It's an important endeavor, so don't get me wrong, but I wanted to change systems. And so I ended up finding my way into public health school and really looking at sort of public health and the social determinants of health, and really sort of public policy is the way that you change systems. And so I sort of found my way into public policy through public health.
And as the founding executive director of both Crime Lab and Education Lab, but right before that, what was the first job, either out of college or grad school?
The first job was actually as a Soros Justice Fellow. I was the first year of fellows that they had. I joke that if I had to apply now, I might not make the cut, but I was thinking.
That's true.
It gave me the opportunity. They sort of allow you to craft a role that puts you in a public sector role to try to advance justice. And I had a wonderful opportunity to work for the Attorney General of Massachusetts, trying to advance things like improving gun policy and gun violence prevention, and also looking at the role, back before it was sort of popular to even see it this way, the role that the school to prison pipeline played in sort of driving young people into the justice system. So using the platform of the Attorney General's office, really trying to improve public policy on school to prison pipeline as well as gun violence. So that was my first job out of after grad school.
So life experience, educational opportunity, exposure through the Soros Fellowship, and then the work that you were doing, you're kind of step by step going down this particular path. And it sounds like each step was either that much more exciting or that much more troubling. You're a system changer. And so tell us, how do you go about creating a crime lab, an education lab, urban labs? I guess, it was probably easy and everybody signed on immediately, and I mean, you were just off to the races, right?
Well, I had a really...
You know my humor.
Yes, I do. I appreciate that. It's still not easy, but no, but it's also just a tremendous privilege and opportunity. And it really comes back to the power and potential of a place like the University of Chicago, just, a world-renowned research university, more Nobel Prize winners than any other university in the world. And yet our home city is struggling with enormous challenges where we have not seen the sort of long-term progress that any of us would like. And so it really felt like the university had both an opportunity and, I would argue, an obligation to use that sort of horsepower, heft, privilege, resources, intellect to try to address not things that are sort of only in the theoretical domain, but also the real world on the ground challenges that a city like Chicago is facing. And so it was an opportunity to try to build on the assets and sort of competitive advantage, if you will, that a place like the University of Chicago has, but to do it in a way that's a little bit different, and to say, rather than researchers by themselves sort of coming up with interesting studies to do, really to talk to community residents, to nonprofits, to policymakers, and ask them what are the problems that they're working on, and is there a way that we can work together by leveraging really good data science and the methodological skills of a place like the University of Chicago to co-produce better evidence. And so, it was sort of a crazy idea in many ways. It's sort of flipping.
What was the reaction when you start talking about this? What do people say?
I think what was encouraging is, the very first thing that we did was talk to a lot of nonprofits and community residents about their experiences. So the truth is, I think often people think that the University of Chicago is supposed to kind of ride in with answers and solutions. And obviously there's so much innovation. There are so many people already working on these challenges. And so what was encouraging to me when I was sort of starting to talk to just a whole range of people across Chicago was just the tremendous wealth of good ideas and experience that could be brought to bear. And I was really pleasantly surprised by the appetite to do this kind of work in partnership, that there was sort of a natural kind of synergy between those who are on the ground solving problems and the ability to bring the sort of skills that a place like the University of Chicago is fortunate enough to amass around data science and research, and to come together. So, it's not been a straight line or always smooth, but I think that there has been, I think, a real appetite to try to bring these sort of resources to solve real world on the ground problems, and not just for researchers to publish papers, which is, there's a place for that, but to also important. Kind of roll their sleeves up and be in partnership in this work itself.
Yeah. And so initially it was the Crime Lab and Education Lab. One might wonder, is there some connection? Do you think there's a connection between the two, and why those two initially? Today there are of course 5 labs, but why those two?
Well, so the impetus to start the labs was a really tragic incident, basically on the campus of the University of Chicago. A young man from Senegal was shot and killed, and that really galvanized a lot of civic leadership attention and university focus. And so that the issue of gun violence was sort of a place to start. But I think sort of our theory of change is, in some sense, government is both the problem. If you look at how persistent these challenges are, clearly government has not risen to the occasion or kind of fulfilled its obligation of basic safety and opportunity. And yet government is also probably one of the only ways to scale effective solutions. So they're both the problem and arguably the solution. And so when you think of a city like Chicago or cities around the United States, 2 of the most important sort of things that determine quality of life are education and education opportunity and fundamental safety. And so in some sense, those were the 2 biggest levers or places where we needed to see dramatic improvement, where you have the levers at least in part, at the sort of ground level, at the city level. So working on both of those felt important if we were going to see dramatic change and improvements in opportunities.
So let's dig a little deeper into the work. We get a little preview or explanation of the why and a little bit of the how. Let's talk about what do the labs do? What's the work?
It's a lot of different things. I think at its core, all of it is sort of the goal of the sort of through line when you think about all of the different projects that were involved in our initiatives, is to really meet the obligation to the public part of public sector. And I think in so many ways, and I think 2020, I think really, if people weren't paying attention, hopefully they are now, underscored all the ways that systems have failed communities of color in particular. And so the sort of all the different work that we're doing in one way or another is about trying to get the public sector to be more transparent, more responsive, more fair and just and effective. And so we have a big set of projects with the Chicago Public Schools. And while I think many would kind of point to the tremendous progress that Chicago Public Schools has made, it really has stood out among urban districts in terms of the progress. There are still shockingly high numbers of young people, and in particular, young men of color, who have not benefited from the progress and who are being left behind. And often those young people end up in what is sort of referred to as the alternative system. So we have a number of projects that are around trying to understand how young people end up in the alternative system, kind of what is the pathway and where might there be opportunities to intervene and sort of change the system to do things differently. But for the kids who do end up there, how can we ensure that they are getting an equitable set of resources and opportunities? And so it's sort of a range of different projects, things like a program that we've been evaluating called Choose to Change, which is an intensive mentoring and trauma-informed set of services to meet young people where they are. So rather than having it connected to a school building, we recognize that, and especially during COVID, many young people are tenuously connected to these institutions in the first place. And we need to make sure we meet them where they are, as opposed to expecting them to, meet the adults where the adults are. So we're working on a range of projects to try to both reduce the sort of number of young people who don't get a high school diploma, and also ensure that the young people who end up in the so-called alternative system or option school system are getting the quality of opportunities that they are going to need to really have opportunities in their future. And we also work with the Chicago Police Department, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about, which in this moment is without question in and of itself a sort of controversial act. And I think it's important to say, again, our sort of mission and focus is on the public part of public sector. And the fact that we are trying to work to help reform and change policing is because it is not working. We're not working with that sector or system because it's a well-oiled machine, but because there are so many ways that it is sort of really not meeting the goals of safety or justice. And so there's a lot of work that we're doing in that space. And then we have the opportunity to work with a number of different community organizations, because I think community-based organizations are able to be nimble and responsive in a way often that government can't. So they can in some ways be the sort of frontier of innovation that hopefully can then teach the public sector what the public sector needs to be doing or investing in. So
and help to scale up.
And help to scale up, exactly.
Yeah. So obviously I've been to the office numerous times, and the staff, and I mean, they are the busiest bees ever. But when I ask you to talk about the partnerships and relationships, I mean, how do you get the work done? What do the labs do? And what do they not do? And how those partnerships are so essential to effectuating change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, and not just for the labs, but I think any researchers who really want to be, do things beyond published papers, but really see research used to change systems and structures. I think it requires being proximate to the individuals that are bearing the burden, but also to the individuals that have ideas of what could make the biggest difference, and to really be working closely and including their voice and perspective in it. So, it's not that, we certainly hire data scientists and people who work with data, but in some sense, that's a small fraction of what we're doing. We're spending a lot of time. We hire individuals who are often from the neighborhoods where we're doing this work, but we also are spending a lot of time ensuring that we're, really closely connected to the people and the neighborhoods and the nonprofits that we're working with, so that we can understand. We're not just sitting in Hyde Park looking at our computer at data, but really understand, those data are people and people's stories and lives, and we need to understand that in a way that helps us then interpret, with the partners, what some of the sort of insights or implications might be. So it's a long way of saying, and it's a shout out to folks in the audience, we definitely want people who have really good data skills and research skills and understand the sort of methodology, but we also want people who are mission driven and want to spend time not just sitting in a computer, but really out in neighborhoods and in the schools and in the different areas of the city, as part of the production process. So this is not something that we're doing sort of from a distance. So we hire a range of different skills and roles within labs to do that work.
You used a term a little earlier in response to a different question that may not be as familiar to some folks. You talked about an alternative system. What did you mean by that? And is that in reference to other aspects of the criminal justice system or law enforcement? And then I want to talk about one of the partnerships, which is actually working with the police and certainly some of the challenges pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic of some of these relationships. What's the alternative system?
Yeah, sorry, I should not use so much jargon. So
that's all right.
The alternative system.
We're a public policy school. How can we work without jargon?
Yeah, so sorry, the alternative system that I was referring to is in Chicago public schools and in cities across the country. There is often a set of what is considered second chance or last chance schools, often for kids who have either been pushed out or have come into contact with the justice system and are kind of coming out of the system. And in Chicago, I think that the sort of assumption had been that these quote unquote alternative schools, or in the Chicago parlance, they're called option schools, was a small number of schools and a small share of students that end up going through them. And until we started really trying to understand who the students were that ended up in them and what their outcomes were, I think none of us, including people who work inside Chicago public schools, understood how large the number of students are that end up in that system. So it's something like 1 in 6 high school students end up in the alternative system. The graduation rate, if you do end up in the alternative schools, is about 35%. And by almost every measure, these are some of the most kind of marginalized and young people that have faced more barriers than just about anybody in the city. And then they end up kind of concentrated in the system. Now, I want to be very quick to also say that that could lead you to conclude that the alternative school system is, quote, the problem. In fact, when we look at the students who still stay in neighborhood high schools, but look sort of like the kids in the alternative system, they're also not graduating from their neighborhood high school. So almost regardless of what door these students are kind of going into in the broader Chicago public school context, we are not doing right by them. We are not meeting their needs. And this is a system problem and something that we really, I would argue it really is the sort of equity issue for the district. If we still have disproportionately Black boys that are ending up in the system, or even if they end up in the neighborhood high school not graduating, it is not their fault. The system needs to figure out what they are doing wrong and how to really do much, much better. And in fact, I would go one step further and say, this has been happening in plain sight, and yet in many ways, the sort of life and well-being of these young people has sort of been, I don't want to say intentionally, but certainly we have not made the effort, all of us, to really understand these patterns. And in fact, until very recently, the way that the district calculated their graduation rate was if a young person ended up in an alternative school, an option school, and managed to graduate, they would count towards the district's graduation rate from the school that they went from. If they don't manage to get a high school diploma, they don't count as a dropout, which is sort of stacking the deck. And I remember early on when we were starting to do some of this work, talking to sort of education philanthropy and saying, there's a huge group of young people that we are failing and we need to be investing in them and understand and pushing the district to do better by them. And what I heard over and over again is those kids weren't really a priority. And I just thought that's just, we cannot turn a blind eye. So
Sure.
That's what I meant by the alternative. I apologize.
Yeah. No throwaway people. disconnect the youth, all of us have an obligation to try to figure out how to reconnect them. You made reference earlier, I want to talk about 2020. The coronavirus, COVID-19, has revealed, if we didn't see it before, has revealed every deficiency, every inadequacy in every possible system. And where there were cracks, they're now, wide open. A worldwide pandemic, significant economic crisis, civil unrest, protests the likes of which we, for many of us, probably haven't seen since we all like to talk about 1968. And it continues. We also had a presidential election in there, and that, contributed. Many cities, certainly talking about my own, Philadelphia, Chicago, and a number of others across the country, also saw significant increases in violent crime, gun crime in particular. Large, massive, continuous demonstrations and public outcry about police brutality and a broken relationship between community and police and community. You work with, of course, police departments. They are a partner in the work. Outcries of, reduce their funding or defund the police, and at the same time, officers need to be better trained, which does require money. And so how do you do that work? How do you thread that needle, and how do you keep the partnerships and the relationships focused and straight, and try to explain maybe to 2 or 3 different constituencies why you continue to do the work the way you do?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, or there's a lot of questions embedded in that. And I think it's, really, really important to recognize that, 2020 showed us just how fragile and broken and tenuous our social safety net is at all. And I think it exposed every rift, and the sort of trust in police is certainly at an all-time low. Trust in government is at an all-time low. And I think what we saw in 2020 was just massive systems failure at every level. And so as we are now, I think in many ways, what I would say is 2020, I think, created an opportunity for larger, bolder, more significant change than I dare to hope for in my lifetime, or at least say out loud. There is now a dramatic opening for very, very significant change. And I think it is really, really important that sort of the role that we play is to try to be the honest brokers of, here is the data, here is the information, so that the residents, and in particular, Black and Brown communities, have much more transparency in what their government is and is not doing, and that the voices that they have been raising get heard about what people want from their government, including the police department. And so when you say, sort of rationalize or justify working with the police department, it is really, the community residents should decide what they want from their government and what they want policing to look like, or no police and other ways to respond. While we do still have something that is sort of called a police department, what we've been trying to do is try to ensure that they implement the reforms that were negotiated and that are now a requirement. So we have a number of projects that are around reform. And you you touched on the huge surge in gun violence. And I think what has really been, a missed opportunity in the sort of public discourse is often it's sort of pitted as, we can either have criminal justice reform or we can reduce gun violence. We have to do both.
Right.
We have to and must reduce the jail population and people on supervision and all of the harms of the criminal justice system, and reduce gun violence. And we can do both of those things, but we have to really be willing to hold ourselves and our systems accountable in doing that. And I think it's really, it should be up to the public to decide what their government does in their name and in their communities. And I think that a huge part of the work that we're doing is around data democratization and trying to push out information in ways that allow residents to, frankly, government is unbelievably opaque. And how can you argue for something different when you don't even know where the dollars are currently going?
Right.
And so that's part of the work that we're doing.
Yeah. One of the things that has amazed me, certainly in 2020, again, in numerous cities, so it's not just the Philly, Chicago thing, that violent crime went up when almost all of us, for at least 3/4 of the year, were under varying levels of lockdown orders and had to stay in our homes. And yet we saw a significant rise. Do you have any thoughts or theories on just what happened in 2020? Chicago, and I should say, and you're going to say it, I'm sure, prior to 2020, Chicago had actually been on what I think was a 3-year decline in violent crime, shootings, and homicides, which I consider to be a bit of a trend if you get 3 years in a row. And then we saw across the country, small, medium, and large cities, this significant uptick. Just some thoughts or theory on that?
Yeah, I think lots of people have very, very strong opinions and claim they know definitively exactly what it is. But I think, I think it was multiple things happening all at once. You had a once in a century pandemic that just tore apart any semblance of a safety net that we had, social service providers, and even the sort of school system having to shut down. So I think it's really, people have not, I think, paid as much attention as they should to the impact that has that sort of, certainly COVID's going to have an impact on the economy and all kinds of other things, but just the inability for any sort of services, any sort of structure, and and then the stress and the trauma that in and of itself imposed. And the CDC recently put out some data that 1 in 5 teenagers or young adults has contemplated suicide in the last 5 days.
Right.
I mean, these were where we saw gun violence before the pandemic, even in the quote good old days, which were not so good, even with the 3-year sort of trend going down. We saw gun violence increase dramatically. And those were neighborhoods already under tremendous stress. People talk about post-traumatic stress. This is ongoing, continuing. And then you add in the pandemic, and then you pull away any services, support, structure, semblance of positive outlets. Classmates, all of that. And then, yeah, and so it's just, and unfortunately, as I think we all know, when you do have a little bit more gun violence, especially when you have a police department that doesn't have the trust and legitimacy and is solving 5% of shootings, non-fatal shootings, that incident often leads to another incident, which leads to another incident. And then we get into this vicious downward spiral that I think—
the back and forth and retaliation.
So I think, I think for sure, the sort of COVID writ large in lots of different ways, I think contributed to it. And then the sort of, lack of legitimacy and trust and all of the important questions around the role of policing in society, I think has had sort of a reverberation or an impact on both communities' willingness to trust the police, and I think created some uncertainty for police around the sort of role that they are supposed to play. And so, I think some writers have made hay on the sort of quote Ferguson effect, and I think that is a dramatic oversimplification of a much more nuanced, complicated set of dynamics.
One last thing in this area, and I know we're getting ready to go to Q&A, and I want to try to pull all this together because you've done such a fantastic job laying it out. So in my commentary, when I'm in conversation, I've been trying actually to take the word policing out of my vocabulary and replace it with public safety. My thought is that policing sounds like something that is done to you, and public safety is something that is done for you. And so, you know, and I mean, just a word change is not going to make everybody safer, but words do matter, and helps to maybe change some of the mindset. We've talked about public safety, we've talked about education, why they're tied together. And so not specific to Chicago or Philadelphia, but the role of mayors in this work all across the country, and knowing some of the challenges. How do you pull it all together to say, you know, these are some of the things that any of us should be doing in our locales, in the current context, and hopefully coming out of economic recession, coming out of COVID-19, getting kids back to school. You think about the last year and a half, basically two, for many of our young people. How do you pull it all together, and what's the advice and recommendation you give to public policy leaders, elected, appointed, civic people, and the like?
Well, first of all, I like the direction that you're going, moving away from policing and sort of kind of broadening the scope to safety. And I think it is actually a really important thing to reimagine safety, because from my perspective, it is a problem when every time we talk about what happened in Chicago or any other city in terms of gun violence, and the single person standing there is the police leader. I think that is in some sense the problem, right? That we have not understood that as the CEO of the city, the mayor has responsibility for safety of their residents. And if the only lever we are using is the police, we've basically let all the other parts of the system and the city off the hook of bearing any responsibility. And the police department, no matter how much training or tools or whatever, they're not and should not be the ones doing it alone. And then we've invested in street outreach organizations, which are incredibly important, doing vital work. But even that's a mitigation strategy. By the time we are trying to stop the next shooting for, you know, an adult who already has been failed by all these other front end systems. So my argument to mayors is to really look at the whole of government approach to ensuring that residents have the resources they need. You know, we are a city of 50, we have 50 aldermen, 50 wards. Too often we divide up the resources, you know, by 50, as opposed to saying, let's use an equity or a needs-based lens, and let's also make sure that residents have a voice in shaping what they want in their neighborhoods. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think, you know, step one is recognizing that public safety and policing should not be synonymous, and that it needs to be a whole of government responsibility. There needs to be transparency and accountability. I am just shocked by how hard it still is to get governments to share information with residents. It's about them and their lives. Why are we not doing more to put that information into the hands of residents? And, you know, I think just to sort of maybe make the point about broadening the aperture, we have the sort of good fortune of working with a really stellar group of nonprofits doing anti-violence work. They're working, you know, the men that they're working with, because they are the ones disproportionately involved in the gun violence, 90% of gun violence victims in our city are well over the age of 18. And when we look at those men who end up in that program, it happens to be called READY, but there are other really terrific programs, CRED and CP4P, that are serving a similar population. When we look at the men and we sort of look at their developmental history, we go back to their last touch point, which was in the school system as a 18-year-old 10th grader in an alternative school. And then we go back a little bit further and we see that they were in age cycle 15, so old for grade, 8th grader. And that you know, and again, this is not to say that it is the school system's responsibility to solve every sort of system failure, but we certainly have information that is telling us that we are failing young people and families, and we're not acting on it effectively. So I really think it's important for mayors to break down those silos, to make, you know, safety and justice, you know, and educational opportunity sort of the core things that they do, because everything else, you can't do economic development. You can't be a world-class city if you can't provide basic safety to your residents.
Yeah. I know I want to be respectful of time. You've given some broad advice, certainly to public policy officials in government. We've got the young leaders of the country and the world at the Harris School. And this is essentially it's kind of a way station in their life. They're going to leave at some point and go out into the world. So your thoughts and recommendation, your experience, your life journey and work, some recommendations for young people who want to know how do I get engaged? How do I get involved? How do I become the next Rosanna Ander and do my thing, whatever that might be?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled that people are going to the Harris School of Public Policy. I really do think it is a world-class institution and does tremendous training, both in terms of the rigor that you need to have to be able to be empirical, to be able to really make sound judgment and understand policy impact, but it also provides opportunity to get hands-on experience. And I think in this moment when there is so little trust and faith in government, I don't think the answer is to then outsource all of the responsibility to non-governmental entities. I think government has a fundamental responsibility to its residents, and we need people to be willing to go into government and to change what it does and how it does it. I think there's definitely really important roles to play outside government to pressure government, but I also think we need good people to go into government. We need the best and the brightest to be willing to do this job that is often thankless and you don't get the limelight always, but it is when you are working inside a government agency and you are making decisions, you are potentially having population level impact. It is an awesome responsibility. So you do need the training and skills you get at Harris, but we need great people to do that. And I think, get a range of different experience. Like one of the questions I thought you were going to ask me was something about, what do nonprofit leaders need to understand about government and vice versa? And I think that's actually a really important question. And I've had the opportunity to kind of work in government and sort of outside of government. And I think having both perspectives is super, super helpful to be effective. I think It's easy to be outside government and see all the flaws and failures and think it would be so easy to fix. And then you go inside government and you just see all the Byzantine rules and things that are just ridiculous barriers. And then likewise, we in our country, I think, have abdicated fundamental government responsibility and outsourced the hardest things to nonprofits that are living hand to mouth and don't have budgets that go beyond the next year because, the idiosyncrasies of the philanthropic and funding community. So I think understanding both of those and figuring out how we can work together and use the sort of, the outside inside strategies in a way that kind of really drives towards more effective public policy and better and more responsive government.
A couple last questions. And also I want to make sure, I'd love to hear you talk about your staff, the challenges they face in a COVID environment, the things that you've seen and your observations over time. What has changed about the work? How do you stay motivated? Got a couple questions in the chat about effective gun safety policies, so describe it that way, as well as, you're working with the police. There's certainly some things that any police department does that is really upsetting to community people. You have a relationship. How do you get a large, very, rules-focused bureaucratic organization to change at the same time you're trying to implement a variety of policies and change from some of the things that they're doing? Talk about change.
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. And I wish we were not so short on time. And I want to make sure I'm happy to give out my email address, or if the folks who organize this want to give it out, because I see lots of fantastic questions in the chat that I would also love to get to, including from some of my friends and colleagues. So, I think one of the things that I really think is important to acknowledge is the sort of ecosystem. And so there are many organizations, and it's always dangerous to single one out. But I think the Invisible Institute, which got the Laquan McDonald video, made sure that saw the light of day. That external pressure is so incredibly important to get systems to change. And so I think it is really, really important for all of the work that's being done, kind of the advocacy, the sort of community organizing work, to continue to create pressure. And then you do have to have people both inside those systems and working with those systems to help them change. Because when you have an organization as big as the Chicago Public Schools or the Chicago Police Department, it is trying to turn the Titanic, so to speak. And so really figuring out how to get them to move as quickly as possible, given that life and liberty are at stake with the decisions that they make. And so, I think the work of Invisible Institute, the consent decree that is now in place, what were really important kind of pressure points. And now what we're doing is, trying to provide some external resources to make them move even more quickly. So we're developing trainings, we're building a system to flag officers that are problem officers so that the department can intervene earlier. If we let the department sort of move on its own pace, or do it the way government sometimes does it without the sort of expertise that a place like University of Chicago could bring to bear, it would move more slowly, it would change more slowly. And I don't think it would be the sort of quality of training or kind of data systems that we're able to bring to bear. So anyway, there are just a million questions that I realize I'm not going to get a chance to answer on this.
Let's talk about data. Let's talk about that in the context of technology. Outdoor video surveillance cameras, body cams, algorithms, AI. What's the role as you see it in the future? What role does technology play in public safety and educational advancement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really critical that whatever technology is being used in any sector to make high stakes decisions on behalf of the public needs to be transparent, needs to, there should be regulation. I mean, one of the things that I worry about and we spend a lot of time thinking about, so the early warning system that we're building for the Chicago Police Department to flag officers that might be kind of on a trajectory that's not going to be good for the public they're supposed to serve, or for the department writ large, is an algorithm. But we're building it hands above the table, transparent. We're not building it as a black box to then sell to other cities. We don't take money. We're not trying to sell it. And so I think it really is about the sort of regulation, the oversight, the accountability, and that the sort of people whose lives are going to be affected by it have a voice in it and can see it. And I do have real concerns. I don't want to sort of completely knock the private sector, but I do worry that there are lots and lots of algorithms in particular that are being sold to government agencies, where the government agency itself doesn't know how the algorithm works, doesn't even know necessarily what data is being fed in. That's really troubling to me. So I think with tools and technology, it's all about the oversight, regulation, transparency, and the particular use case. So I think we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle in terms of technology. And I think our lives are basically run by technology, from trivial decisions to life and death decisions. So it's really a matter of the right guardrails, regulations, and oversight, and sort of transparency around it.
I do believe at some point we're going to come out of this, kind of current environment, but the work, certainly continues. But one day, we'll all either meet in person or be in an office or whatever the case may be. So, again, got students who are going to come out of school. What's it like to work at the labs? What kind of jobs are there? What's the nature of the work? Those kinds of things. I mean, you might have some budding, future employees on this call.
Yeah, no, so we do hire people who have really good sort of research method skills and data science skills, but we also we want to hire wherever possible people who have grown up in the communities where the work is happening. So we do a lot of work with Chicago Public Schools in particular to create internship and other opportunities. But some of the roles are implementation managers. Some of the roles are project or managing a portfolio of projects. So one of our staff members, Reese Gaines, grew up in North Lawndale. He's been working on with really managing our partnership with My Block, My Hood, My City. He's been doing some work with the Chicago Police Department around how they do community engagement, particularly on the West Side. And so, we are doing that kind of work all the way, on the other side of the spectrum. So that's very much out in the community, not really, I don't ever see him back when we were, quote, in the office. I didn't see much of Reese. I talked to him on a regular basis, but I didn't get to see a lot of him because he was always out in neighborhoods. And then to the other extreme, we do have people who just like to do the data science work, but people are working in teams. So even the data scientists understand the context, what the questions are that we're trying to answer, how the data got produced in the first place. So there's a real kind of team approach. And so, we hire, lots of interns. So you don't have to have a diploma or even a bachelor's degree. We do hire entry-level folks, who are coming out of college and want opportunities to work with nonprofits, with public agencies, do project management, do data work, all the way up to people who have PhDs, which I myself do not. I thought one day I might go get one, but I think it's I think it's too late.
Never too late. Never too late. I know a great school, that you might want to do that work.
Yeah, I'll take the suggestion. Yeah.
Oh boy. Give us some closing thoughts and comments as we come up on our time.
Well, it's hard to do this remote. I really do look forward to the day when I can be in the room. To me, that is just like that, feeds my soul, being directly with people. And it's been a privilege to work at the University of Chicago. I know that there is also some baggage. And I think it's really, we have an opportunity as an institution to try to do right and try to atone for, the sins of the past, so to speak, by trying to do right now and do better. And this is it's an incredibly important time. The needs in our cities and in our communities have never been greater. And the resources are really, really, especially with the economic impact of COVID, are going to be very constrained. So we need as much time and talent doing this work as possible. And I'm happy to follow up with anybody whose question, and I apologize, there were a lot of them that didn't get answered. And thank you, Mayor Nutter. I think you are, about the best example of a public servant as I've ever come across. And I think, the best advice would be to follow your lead.
Well, they can do better than that, but I've certainly love our partnership and relationship, and I've learned so much from you and the whole team. And then, in other environments, I get to talk about the great things that you all are doing. So again, Era and the entire group who, actually put these things together. They don't just happen. So there's a lot of pre-work that goes into this. And I want to thank all the folks who have been involved and helped us for the evening. So I think with that, wish everyone a good night and please stay safe. Thanks, Rosanna.
Thank you. And thanks, Era.
Thanks.